This means that whoever wrote that identification out intends for the receiving audience to make a connection based on everything that has come before and everything that will follow. Perhaps even make us realize that the event being described isn't merely about some lustful tryst, but is potentially one full of political intrigue. The accusation of rape seems to first be applied to the illicit encounter between David and Bathsheba in a Journal for the Study of the Old Testament series supplement titled Fragmented Women by J. Sherrill Exum. The subtitle for the supplement is especially informative: Feminist Subversions of Biblical Narratives. To say that is not suggestive, it would be an understatement, and Exum leans into the fact in the preface where she writes, "This book explores the gender ideology that informs selected biblical narratives in order to reveal strategies by which the patriarchal literature excludes, marginalizes, and otherwise operates to subjugate women." What's interesting is that while Exum is not interested in necessarily accusing David of rape, she does make room for it, writing, "Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, is sent for by King David, who has sex with her in a moment of passion that unleashes a chain of disaster upon his house. It is not my intention to make David's exploitation of Bathsheba into a rape, though I will explore its potential for such an interpretation below. The rape of Bathsheba is something that takes place not so much in the story as by means of the story." So she does try to be fair in her presentation and shift it more to a presentation of Bathsheba that is a violation of her character that consists of depriving her of voice and in portraying her in an ambiguous light that leaves her vulnerable, page 171. But more than that, Exum recognizes there is a certain reality to the narrative that reflects particular values for the culture, noting that the stories show us a society's norms and they show us how that society responds to the violation of those norms. Moreover, by presenting models of acceptable and unacceptable behavior for men and women, by encoding messages to men and women about sexual transgressions and sexual limits, they shape and perpetuate gender roles and expectations. And I would mostly agree that there's certain expectation that exists within the text of a certain form of conduct that is uniquely cultural from a historical perspective, as well as universally moral, that needs to be drawn out from the text. The problem is that Exum isn't interested in dealing with the text as the text. That is, in accordance with how the original author intended for the text to be understood in its original context, in relationship with Bathsheba's overarching narrative in Jewish theological history, which is where the incident finds itself playing out in the Davidic narrative. Rather, Exum seeks to give a feminist response to that incident, page 172. In order to address Exum's claim that Bathsheba is deprived of her voice, we need to refresh our memory regarding the presentation of the narrative as it appears in 2 Samuel 11, 1-5. Engaging with the narrative. While the entire scene that we're referring to takes up considerably more space in the body of 2 Samuel, our interest is in the inciting incident when David, now the established king of Israel, rather than outdoing the things that kings would do, decides not to do them. Whatever David's reasons were, be it the exhaustion of warfare or domestic matters that required his immediate personal oversight, David finds himself late in the afternoon walking around on the roof, looking down on the city, and there he sees that a woman, presumably, and often portrayed as naked, bathing. One commentator on this passage notes something that is often overlooked in this scene. It's actually a matter of scale when it comes to our perception, where he writes, David's Jerusalem was small, 12 to 15 acres, and all of it crowded. Archaeologists in Jerusalem have found a large stone structure from the time of David that may be his palace. Regardless of whether the building discovered was the actual residence, the space between the palace and Bathsheba's house could hardly have been more than 20 feet. Moreover, it's especially relevant to consider the fact that the height of one's home in that culture also communicates one's status in the community. David's point of view would have been noticeably higher, and anyone would have realized, given the prominence of the king's house, that from such a vantage point, their living quarters and compound would have been subject to viewing from that perspective. Another important fact that is attributed but unjustified presumption is that Bathsheba is naked when she's under observation. The text doesn't state that point explicitly, though it can be inferred. However, the issue is one of timing and location, as the late evening would have been such a time for the people to gather on their roofs and even take in an evening meal. This would not have been night, but just before dark. Moreover, there's the cultural perception regarding nakedness in itself. Specifically, women wouldn't expose themselves to the public, physically at least, lest they appear unchaste. This is especially relevant considering since Bathsheba was married, presumably, her body was perceived as being the property of her husband. Moreover, where's the consideration for the woman's concern for her own personal propriety, i.e. shame, in the greater society? Also, where's Bathsheba's concern for her husband's honor? This means Bathsheba's choice of time and place for her bath seems to somewhat betray the deliberate plan on her part, at least as one person has noted on this matter. Hello. It cannot be doubted that Bathsheba's action in bathing so close to the king's residence was provocative, nor can the possibility the provocation was deliberate be discounted. Even if it was not deliberate, Bathsheba's bathing in a place so clearly open to the king's palace can hardly indicate less than a contributory negligence on her part. However, most recent commentators seem to overlook that the writer seems to expect the audience to pick up on that. As one particular online commentary notes, over the course of history, this encounter between David and Bathsheba has often been described as adultery, which implies mutual consent. However, we see that it's actually a sexual abuse of power. In other words, rape. Arguing from silence. One of the likely retorts that one might have regarding the statement of these facts is that it seems that we're making an argument from silence. However, this is simply not the case. Reporting relevant cultural information or considerations is necessary to engage the biblical text accurately, because it was written from a point of view of a different culture, with different standards of communication. So, to prevent a misreading of the text, this is necessary. We see such potential in instances where different cultural context is appealed to in order to make an argument, such as that online commentary where the author writes, "People who think that she agreed to come to the palace willingly do not understand that when an ancient ruler summoned a subject to the palace, the subject had no choice but to comply." Now, in an attempt to justify this assertion, the author appeals to passages from the book of Esther. And this should immediately cause a thoughtful reader to pause and note that this is not evidence for the claim, as Esther represents understandings from a Persian culture and is centered in that location. The author presents no reason to assume that this has any relevance to any particular Israelite culture at the time of David. It is simply asserted. So I want to digress because we're running ahead just a little bit on the narrative end. But this is relevant. And so we need to pull back so we can focus on the instigation of events. Was it David's outreach, or was it Bathsheba's signaling that satisfies the inquiry? Feminist interpreters such as Exum necessarily focus on David. Indeed, the narrative focus is on the king and the results of his actions. However, we should inquire as to whether we are missing the trees for the forest and obscuring necessary elements of the narrative in favor of our own narrative that we're imposing on the text. We must recognize that the writers expect the audience to understand the goings-on in light of what is not said but is necessarily understood. Exum's arguments are largely complaints, and the narrator's use of the spotlight to focus on David as a primary character in this vignette. I mean, he is the primary character of 2 Samuel as opposed to Bathsheba. She notes, the point is not what Bathsheba might have done or felt. The point is, we are not allowed to access her point of view. There is no attempted seduction recounted which would give the woman a role, even if one in which she is manipulated. The denial of subjectivity is an important factor in the rape, where the victim is objectified and indeed the aim is to destroy her subjectivity. Such accusations stem from a fundamentally myopic position and represent a backdoor attempt to assault the narrator's choices and rhetorical focus. Indeed, such short-sighted readings that misplace the focus and misattribute motivation should cause us to rethink the scene and place it in its proper context as a study of David's life and how there seems to be particular emphasis placed in his pursuit of certain women, particularly those of high social or patronymic status. We as Western individualists tend to miss the subtle cues that are often going on the page that non-Western readers would notice and would pay attention to because they're not so different from the biblical world. Because our concerns are different. The narrator gives us the identity of the woman that David is looking for, and we lose interest soon after her name, Bathsheba, is given. However, that's not the end of her identification. She's identified as the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Indeed, we seem to only focus on the fact that a woman's name and the fact she's someone's wife is necessary to the narrative. And the fact she is someone's daughter is merely obvious, but otherwise optional. It's extraneous to us. But we must recognize that biblical authors were being very deliberate in their writing, and every word and description are intentional, and there is nothing extraneous in their work. After all, these men were inspired by God, who guided the formation of the content, and the same God knew that one day we would read the text. This means that whoever wrote that identification out intends for the receiving audience to make a connection based on everything that has come before and everything that will follow. Perhaps to even make us realize that the event being described isn't merely about some lustful tryst, but is potentially one full of political intrigue. Those that ignore the cultural context of the writer and the earliest audience say that to point out such subtle assumptions of the text is essentially blaming the victim, because she was, quote, conveyed to the chamber of a man possessing great power and a history of violence. But then they would have to prove and not merely assume that this was merely about opportunistic sex rather than a mutually agreed upon political union, as there is some evidence to suggest that Bathsheba may have been manipulated by the king, first by bathing where she might easily come to his attention, perhaps even deliberately flaunting her naked body before him, then by informing him of her pregnancy. The problem of action. The entire affair between David and Bathsheba is built around a set of verbal clauses in 2 Samuel 11, verse 4. Whether it's Exum or other commentators echoing her position, whether knowingly or not, there's an undue focus on David having sent for Bathsheba and having taken her. However, careful readers would recognize that those same words, in the original language at least, have been used of David once before when he goes to regain his wife, Michal. The use of those words in that similar context does not reflect the degree of force or otherwise with which the taking was done. The violence, however, appears directed wholly against the husband and not against the wife. Moreover, there seems to be a narrative rearrangement in the text, as there are certain chronological cues that seem to indicate this scene is out of place. This is especially relevant since Bathsheba's grandfather Ahithophel becomes a co-conspirator with Absalom in his attempt to overthrow David and begs an important question. As Randall Bailey notes, if Bathsheba were already a member of David's harem, then her offspring and Ahithophel's descendant would be a possible heir to the throne. It seems highly unlikely that Ahithophel would have foreclosed such a possibility as his great-grandson becoming king by supporting a rival candidate's overthrow of David. Our disconnected and acontextual reading of the text, also by ignoring subtext, as well as particular relationships with characters, not mentioned making unjustified assumptions about the order of the text, can cause us to stumble into fundamentally unjustified conclusions about particular narratives. And the affair of David and Bathsheba is just one such example, especially if what is occurring is a mutual agreement to restore and reinstate a family that had otherwise been on the outs following a failed coup attempt. If this is the case, then it helps to explain Bathsheba's unlikely marriage to an outsider, as well as the ease to which she abandons her husband to go to David. The chronological displacement of the story, whether intentional or accidental, serves to illustrate the lengths that Bathsheba is willing to go to restore her family's honor in Israelite society. As these are not Western concerns, we often miss when they appear in the narrative. In overlooking these themes, we can miss the subtleties of the text and subsequently misunderstand the message that it is actually attempting to convey. Now, this further explains the narrative's choice of the form of the verbs used to describe the actions, which seem to foreclose any path that assumes that Bathsheba is under any duress or compulsion to submit to David's summons. In fact, they would seem to make her a willing party, if not the initiator of events. The fact the author avoids using verbs of causation, also known as the Hiphil form, and instead uses a form that indicates modes of intentional action, the call form, this demonstrates that she needs to be considered more as an accomplice than a victim. Now, this point is further emphasized by the fact that Bathsheba shows absolutely no distress or no concern about her pregnancy upon its announcement to David. The reason why we can miss this subtle signaling in the rhetoric is manifold, but we just want to surmise just a few of the reasons why we miss these things. First of all, we read the text in translation. While necessary for people who are removed from the original language of the text, it means that we can and do often miss the subtle cues that are present in the language the writer used to signal such matters. Second, we are woefully unfamiliar with the biblical text as a whole. We often see the text merely as a collection of stories, not as a multi-dimensional hyperlinked, to borrow from Jordan Peterson, text. This is further complicated by the fact that we have to read it in translation. Lastly, we're ignorant of the concerns and backgrounds of the original audience. We are ignorant of the concerns and considerations, and in our ignorance, we can and we often do misattribute motives and misrepresent the circumstances. When these factors are combined, we can run headlong into the error of exegesis and subsequently miss what is actually happening in the text, such as the case of David and Bathsheba, or what is often portrayed as merely a lustful act perpetrated by an indolent king is actually a complex and compelling socio-political narrative where an illicit sexual liaison is serving merely as a plot device. The question of why. Now, there are a few matters that require a degree of concession, or at least recognition of concerns of any meaningful or substantive conclusions that can be drawn from the text. And that comes down to the so-called rape interpretation that is so popular, and the issues that arise later simply as a matter of chronology. So let me begin with that last point and say it's entirely possible that the story of Bathsheba at least partially runs concurrent with the story of Absalom. The fact that the redactors chose to address specific incidents individually rather than concurrently could just be an editorial decision. So it may be possible that the events overlap rather than running in succession with one another. It's entirely reasonable to read events as occurring nested within one another, rather than chronologically. Absalom could have used both the event with Bathsheba and his sister Tamar, which follows later, as evidence against his father. Now, why is the rape interpretation so popular and so easy to fall into, aside from the contextual elements that we discussed above? Well, it goes back to something Exum notes as she looks at the narrative when she writes. The point is not what Bathsheba might have done or felt. The point is, we are not allowed to access her point of view. There is no attempted seduction recounted which would give the woman the role, even if one in which she is manipulated. The denial of subjectivity is an important factor in rape, where the victim is objectified, and indeed the aim is to destroy her subjectivity. The issue of force versus consent is crucial for constructing the woman's point of view, and it is never raised. Interestingly, no one's particular point of view is raised in the episode. We are told what a person saw, but we are given no insight into their thoughts. As one observer notes about the passage, there is ambiguous tension between character, action, and motive. We're denied access to any interior insights about what's occurring within any of the characters. This is a just the facts, ma'am type of presentation. So it denies us access and possibly forgoes our tendency to empathize with specific characters. This terse and forthright presentation is to make sure the characters are judged solely on their words and actions. Our tendency to empathize with characters often means that we are denied access to characters' interior narratives. Will often create an external one of forces that would drive a particular person to behave in that manner. Hence, when modern readers read the very terse narrative of 2 Samuel 11, we can begin to entertain fanciful notions of authority or motivations, such as that particular online commentary where it says, "We cannot blame Bathsheba for acquiescing when conveyed into the chamber of a man possessing great power and a history of violence. As the narrative continues, every person reproaches David and none Bathsheba."
Okay.
But let's be careful, because that kind of sort of reeks of an argument from silence, as David, and not Bathsheba, is central to the narrative. We cannot argue that because it was not present in the text, that she was not reproached, either by her husband, seen in his refusal to go to her, or by her grandfather Ahithophel, who betrays David to go with Absalom in his rebellion. But that assumes there wasn't a power dynamic available to Bathsheba. For it's not until after their meeting that they're informed of the nature of the bath that she's initially seen taking. So, that leads us to pose a question, and it's one that George Nickel asked. If a position of power does indeed confer advantage, it becomes a question of what constitutes power. David's position as king, or Bathsheba as one who comes to his bed knowing she is likely to be fertile at the time. Now, when we look at the summation of the event found in the prophetic condemnation, we need to notice something very peculiar. "Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites." 2 Samuel 12:9. Notice, David is only accused of two things: Uriah's death and having taken Bathsheba as his wife. There's no mention of the adulterous act that precipitated the death and which resulted in the marriage. Now, we could argue that it is implicitly condemned in what David has been explicitly accused of, but then we could be straying into some dangerous territory. But then that nonetheless raises other questions, especially about the extent of David's alleged power as king. If David had the absolute power to compel Bathsheba to his bed, as proponents will often assert, why does he not just take her from Uriah? Why does he not just say, "Hey, I'm the king, I can do what I want"?
Your Majesty.
How's it going, Marie? It's good to be the king.
Why is there any concern on David's part about trying to cover up the pregnancy? Why attempt such subterfuge? The fact that such questions aren't being asked is rather telling. In fact, to demonstrate why this assertion of absolute power might be false is very easy to do when we look contextually at the narrative. Specifically, we need to look no further than 1 Kings 21 and the story of Naboth's vineyard. You go to 1 Kings 21, in that story, you're going to see where King Ahab desires to purchase a vineyard from a farmer named Naboth. Naboth refuses to sell the vineyard, and Ahab's wife Jezebel conspires with a group that one translation refers to as worthless men to lay false charges against Naboth. And he's found guilty and subsequently executed. Now, the prophet Elijah comes along and condemns Ahab for his actions. Ahab repents, and he is delayed judgment that had been proclaimed by the prophet. We should note the stark parallel in this story because it demonstrates the power of king was nowhere near as absolute as people would like to think it was. If Ahab was powerless to compel Naboth to sell his vineyard, why should we think that David had power to compel Bathsheba? Second illustration comes, like I've mentioned earlier, from earlier in the life of David, before he consolidates his rule over the kingdom in 2 Samuel 3, when he has to request for his brother-in-law Ishbosheth to return his wife Michal from Paltiel, whom Saul had married her off to while David was on the run. If David couldn't even compel another man to give him his wife back, but had to request it, upon what basis could he then compel Bathsheba? It seems that reading these alleged abuses of power, which are built on mere assumption, necessarily import certain elements into the text that it simply will not support. And there's a technical term for that: exegesis. Someone might ask, though, if that's the case, that a careful socio-grammatical exegesis reveals, why is there an ambiguity in the text that allows for such an assumption to even be possible? Gail Yee gives us some potential insight on this when she writes, "The narrative's ambiguity allows for interaction with the characters, which a more explicitly detailed account does not make possible. Through his technique of literary ambiguity, the author draws his readers into his fictive world. Being purposefully ambiguous, he introduces different and even conflicting narrative possibilities into the story itself and refrains from making a moral judgment until the very end. These possibilities force the readers to confront the situations which he describes and, in doing so, raise moral questions and come to tentative moral judgments about the narrative's characters." Conclusion. The modern trope of David raped Bathsheba, while emotionally compelling, is fundamentally disconnected from the reality of the biblical narrative's historical and cultural context. It arises from a false feminist framework that alleges the writers of Scripture actively suppressed the agency and voice of women in the biblical text, when the reality is that such approaches themselves are what remove the agency and voice of the female characters that appear in the text. Feminist-focused or inspired readings of the text often deny and subsequently misportray the reality of the biblical context. In effect, they are the very ones raping the biblical text in an attempt to mute the divine voice that speaks from the text and seeks to reveal the depravity of mankind and the necessity for salvation from our self-destructive path through Christ Jesus. David did sin. So did Bathsheba. And while the narrative focuses on David's actions, we cannot and should not deny Bathsheba's culpability in any of her actions. While we have David's confession and subsequent repentance for his sin recorded in the text of 2 Samuel 12 and Psalm 51, we have no sign of Bathsheba's regret for her actions, no signs of grief for a dead husband or a dead child. As badly as we want to see ourselves in the characters of the biblical narrative, it is unwise and an ill-fated reading strategy that will cause us to misread and misrepresent the text. The many women who have been mistreated and abused by men in power are terribly misguided and mistaken in any attempt to leverage the story of David and Bathsheba as an example of their plight, for it simply refuses to conform to their expectations when placed against the proper context. However, hear me out here, the text does provide a sufficient divine mandate to condemn each and every man who would use and abuse his position and power in such a way by its means of narrative ambiguity. To try to paint Bathsheba as the victim misses the identity of the actual victim, the actual wronged party in the affair, the person who lost his life as a result of the affair, her husband, Uriah. I'm Sugarman 1976. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure and give it a thumbs up. If you found it interesting, please share it with your friends. If you don't mind, please hit that subscribe button. Be sure and check out the description below for links to the blog where the full version of this video, as well as the sources, can be found, as well as links to my other content and blogs, including my debut action thriller, A Turning of Shadow, which is available on Amazon in Kindle and in paperback. Don't forget, follow me on X and Instagram at Sugarman1976. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.